3rd, 2021, and we are here in the Pyle Center in Tempe with Monti, who has some stories to tell about Tempe. We're going to start out with a little bit about where you were born. Were you born here in Tempe?
I was born at the hospital, Tempe St. Luke's, but it was being run by the Adventists at the time. So the story I'm told is my mother had to get a prescription for meat because they wouldn't serve meat to the patients based on their doctrine unless it was prescribed by the doctor. Doctor who delivered me was Tom Hughes, who did business right down here on Rural for many, many years. And this whole area here was Hughes Acres before it was developed. I live today in the house that Tom was living in when he passed away. When we were in escrow on our house, Tom, I should say next door, it was Tom's house. So it's all very close in. You know, I was born 2 miles that way, if even that, and haven't strayed far.
What about before that? Were your parents from Tempe, or where did they come from?
No. So my parents both came from basically the Midwest for different reasons. My mother came here because she had severe asthma to the point of being placed in an iron lung occasionally. And she was in Indiana. She was born in Plymouth, Indiana. And she was ordered by her doctor, more or less, to move to a dry climate. And in those days, this was a kind of a hypoallergenic environment because that was before we encouraged people to bring their favorite plant and water it all year round. And so she came out here to save her life, essentially. My father had been born in Hibbing, Minnesota, hometown of Bob Dylan and Gino's Pizza and Greyhound bus lines. That was a town that was up on the Iron Range, and he was born there, the first one in our family to be born in the United States on that side, because my grandfather was a master stonemason who was recruited to come to the United States because the iron industry needed European masons who understood how to build very tall smokestacks that would draw correctly but would not collapse. And my grandfather was one of these master masons. He was also an irascible drunk and an anarchist. And so Europe was happy to bid him goodbye. And so he moved over in 1911, and he brought the 4 kids who were already born in Italy and his wife, my grandmother Adele. And then upon arrival in the United States, my father was the first one born, and then there were 3 more born. And in that anarchist spirit, my father's name was Leonard, after the great thinker, and his brother, one of his brothers, was named Spartacus. So that was, they grew up, the 8 kids, poor immigrants in Minnesota. My father was a telegraph operator for the railroad when he was a young man, so he knew Morse code. He also earned money by riding boxcars around the Midwest and fighting in unsanctioned boxing matches. So he was a 5'5", double tough, little banny hen kind of, he could fight. And so he earned money that way. And he ultimately joined the Navy. And so in World War II, he served as a crewman on a torpedo bomber, an Avenger torpedo bomber in the South China Sea. After the war, he had enough snow. His first wife had a stepfather who had a cafe in Phoenix, and the opportunity was there to move the family out and go to work for the stepfather, and that was sort of where he cut his teeth in the restaurant business. And so obviously, I was not present for any of this, but these are all stories I heard him repeat many times. So he began there, and that's so how my mother had come from Indiana and my father came from Minnesota.
Can you describe your home when you were growing up? What was it like, and who lived there with you?
Very humble. Okay, so my dad had been married before and divorced in '61. He had 8 kids by his first marriage, 1 not by his first marriage. My mother had had prior marriages, so she had 3 kids, and then I was the only one between them. When I was born, we were the family residence was on 12th Street, so, again, very close to all this, not very far from the hospital. It was a pretty humble home, really. It was a little tract home that my mom had bought when she came out from Indiana, and my dad just tacked onto it. It was a microcosm of the restaurant. Those of you who recall, the restaurant just rambled on, and over many years additions were made, and our house kind of turned into that as well. So it was on 12th Street, just off of Hardy. Still there. It's been remodeled. I think it's being used as a rental now. But that to me was the essence of Tempe when I was growing up. I basically lived there all the way through college till I went off to law school.
What types of traditions or holidays do you remember as a child? What did your family celebrate?
Well, sort of the Western canon of holidays. I mean, we did Christmas and Halloween and Easter and just different combinations of the blended family. The only ones who were still living at home when I was a kid were from my mother's side, my brother Steve and my sister Pam, because they were my mom's younger two kids. My sister Lorene had married and moved out before I was born. None of my dad's kids were permanently living with us, although occasionally my sisters Tony and Christina would be staying in the house for short periods of time. And so when there were holidays, usually, some would come to our house. Sometimes we'd celebrate at the restaurant. Sometimes we'd celebrate at one of my siblings' homes. But good times, great memories. Nothing too ethnic or Italian or anything like that, because we were a blended family living in Arizona. So just kind of the standard holiday celebrations that any kind of average Arizona family would have.
For the restaurant then, what year did Monti's La Casa Vieja start? And you said nothing too Italian at your home. How did the menu come about for Monti's then?
Well, now this is my father, after he had come out at the end of World War II, for that time that he had worked for his stepfather, but then he had the opportunity to take over food service at the Western Tavern in Chandler, downtown Chandler, which is now Serrano's, that location. And he was there from 46 until 56. He was always a history buff. Now, he didn't have a college diploma, but he was a self-educated and very voracious reader, especially of history, loved history. And so he had been operating just the food service at the Western Tavern. The Western Tavern itself belonged to a family by the name of Dossi. And, they were making plenty of money on the liquor sales. And so his gig was just the food service. And he got a reputation for great steaks. And, bear in mind that this was a time when, let's say, the mainstream average American family wasn't too into strong flavors. And I think his real secret was the steaks were doped with garlic powder. And people didn't think they liked garlic. That was an ethnic food. But that combination of salt, pepper, and granulated garlic, when you hit that Connaughton broiler, that hot top, and you get kind of a char, it's magic. And so we always broiled our steaks on a sheet metal Connaughton broiler that had that super hot sear to it, and that alchemy of interacting with the garlic, right? So he developed this reputation for his steaks there. Now, he had trouble with his back for a long time, slip discs, and those were the days of very primitive treatments for that. So at one point he was in the hospital recovering from an episode with that, and he was listening to the radio to pass the time. And it's my understanding there was a historian named Bert Fireman, I believe, who had a radio show. I'm doing all this from memory, so bear with me, but I'm pretty sure it was Bert Fireman. And Fireman was talking about the Hayden house, known as the Casa Vieja in Tempe, and its significance as the birthplace of Carl Hayden, the founding pioneer home of Tempe, and that planted that thought. He was fascinated by that. And so one evening he had a customer of his whose name was Walker. I believe it was Thomas Walker. And Walker was an ex-military man who was dealing in real estate in Chandler. And the story is that Walker was in a card game somewhere down towards Tucson. And somebody in the card game was running out of cash, and the stakes were rising, and this person reached in and pulled out a sheaf of papers and says, well, I'm out of money, but I have the deed to La Casa Vieja in Tempe. And purportedly at that moment, Walker said, stop the game, I know someone who will buy that right off the table. And persuaded my dad to buy it. Now, I had heard this story from my oldest brother who passed away last year. And what was interesting is, years after I heard my brother tell this story, because it was too late to ask my dad about it, he had already passed, I ran across some documents from the sale of the property. This would have been 1954. And Walker's name was on them as the broker. So that is how in 1954 it changed hands. But he was operating in Chandler till 56 because there were tenants running the restaurant portion of the building because they were just lease tenants, and they didn't want to go, and he didn't have enough money to buy out their lease, and so he had to wait. And they were not happy to go to the point that they didn't want to directly sell him the liquor license. He had to get a straw man to act as an intermediary, and then flip it to him. So in April of 1956, he was able to put his name on La Casa Vieja. Now. The property itself, it was, there were apartments in it, cheap apartments. And over the years, I met a number of people who had actually lived in the building, and there was a small area that, when we were at the end of operations, we always called that area the Hayden Room. So the Hayden Room and the associated waiting rooms, and then the bar, as it was last configured, were the areas that he initially took over. I mean, he bought the whole property, but he actually had some tenants when he bought it. And ultimately, as his fortunes improved and as people moved out, he recaptured more of those rooms for dining rooms. And then he made additions in 1968 and 1978 with a bunch of minor little bits cobbled together in between. But that's how he made that transition from Chandler to Tempe, but very consciously with that love of the history of the building.
I think you said you grew up in the walls. Tell me what that was like.
I mean, my parents used to gather. They had friends who'd gather there quite frequently. They'd entertain there, and I'd get dragged along with the adults. I was born late in my parents' lives. Well, my mom was 41, my dad was 55, and so it was just understood that if they were going to have some friends up there to entertain, I'd be brought along, maybe have a book, but I'd listen to the conversations, which were often ribald, and occupy myself. And sometimes that occupying myself involved wandering through the place. It was like a maze. It was like a haunted house. It was a very colorful place, especially when it was full of people and all these 70s restaurant employees who were like pirates. There's the culture of the place, and being able to go in and out of the kitchen. It was a wonderful, in many ways, a wonderful way to grow up, because it was so, in that sense, unconventional. I got to meet a lot of people, both those who were socializing with my parents and sometimes just striking up conversations with customers. And I'll always believe that I actually, at a pretty young age, learned to carry a conversation with adults because of that environment. But
I know that you have a love of history too. It sounds like you got that partly from your dad.
Yes.
And it sounds like it started before you even went to school. Because
Definitely,
you had this atmosphere that you were surrounded by historic walls, right?
Absolutely.
Maybe ghosts, I don't know. But, and yeah, so what other things about your childhood come to mind that you think you'd like to share with people?
Well, I mean, again, focusing on the restaurant, my parents, they wound up informally creating a friend group that would gather every Saturday for lunch. And it was kind of by invitation. Sometimes friends would get a friend to come.
At the restaurant, not at the house?
At the restaurant.
Okay.
Although, interesting footnote, when I did talk about the Italian thing, let me back up to Chandler, because this is kind of fun. When my dad was in Chandler, of course, the Williams Air Force Base was still operating. And they would bring in pilots from all over the world to train to fly the newest aircraft there. And in those days, my dad was the only guy in town who could speak Italian. And so the Air Force guys would bring the Italian pilots into the Western Tavern to meet him and talk to him. And even after he began operating in Tempe, he'd still occasionally get a batch of Italian fighter pilots who had come to Arizona, and someone would remember to bring them out and talk to him. And not long after I took over the restaurant in 1993, I was doing something, and they called me to the office. They said, "There's a guy on the phone, and he doesn't speak English very well. I think he's Italian." And so I picked up the phone, and it turned out to be a retired Italian Air Force general named Luigi Franco Borione. And he had remembered being just a cadet, like a young lieutenant, and meeting my father and being entertained by my father. Years now, his career in the Italian Air Force had ended. He retired, and he found himself in Los Angeles, and he was trying to see if my dad was still around. And I corresponded with him for a while in Italy. But so that's kind of one of those little unique details, that he would have these Italian pilots, and he brought some to our house. We didn't entertain at home often. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of, when you have a restaurant, especially, he had a restaurant of great renown, it just wasn't a habit to bring people home. It was kind of on the rarer side. But the Italians, he wanted to come home because he wanted my mom to cook something nice for them. And my mom was not Italian, but we traveled every summer. We'd go over to Italy, and she learned a lot of cooking tricks from the family over there. So he would ask her to cook something special for these guys.
So what's your mom's family background then?
She was mixed on one side, sort of English and German, mm-hmm. but on the other side, French Canadian. So her ancestors literally came down in wagons from the French region of Canada. And she had a very difficult childhood, right? My grandfather, her father, was a mechanic, and was a bus he was working on burst into flames, and she was about 5, I think, and he died a few days later. And her mother developed tuberculosis and was sent to Yuma to live out her final days. So my mom and her sister were divided between the two sets of grandparents because neither side had enough money to raise more than one kid. And she had grinding poverty in the early part of her life. And but she was more in touch with, I think, that French Canadian side. So that's really, she wound up here to make a new start of things.
How far away was she from her sister then when they were separated?
Well, she lived for many, many years. And you mean they were in the same town.
In the same town.
But
different people.
Yeah, and I think that the two households weren't all that close. So okay. They had a relationship, but I think it was not quite the warmest sibling relationship.
Not the same as growing up in the same house. Yeah. Right. What about school? Where did you go to school here in Tempe, and what was that like? What was your favorite?
Well, I went to Curry Elementary School. I went to McCamey Junior High
Mm-hmm.
School. I went to Tempe High School. Then I did my undergrad at ASU. And then I went over to University of San Diego Law School. Interestingly, we lived close to Mckell School. Mm-hmm. But again, my father was, always reading and always in touch with what was happening in the community. And at the time, Curry was kind of an experiment. It was an open classroom concept where they built the school as sort of a big shell. And then the library was in the center, and the classrooms were essentially divided only by bookcases and sort of partitions that could be moved. And I think the idea was to have this sense of openness and flow. And it, aesthetically it was nice, but it was a zoo. It was hard to hear and keep order. And I noticed, I visited the school on some occasion, probably 10 years after I'd gotten out of 6th grade. I can't remember why and they had gone back and divided it up into more traditional classrooms. But so it was an interesting experience, and I was sent over there mainly because it was a new thing that my folks thought, well, maybe we should try this out. But then I moved back closer to home to go to junior high. And I was even closer where we lived to Gilland. But my dad knew Joe Sprichelli and thought Joe would be a great guy and to send me to Joe's school. So there I wound up with Mr. Sprichelli and Mr. Flores. And that was a good experience. And now, a couple of my kids have gone through McCamey as well. I'm glad they revived the name McCamey. For a while it was Tempe Academy of, now it's McCamey Academy of International Studies. Nothing extraordinary. I wasn't like an athlete or anything in high school. I was more of a bookworm. I think I enjoyed the company of the stoners, although I didn't partake in their lifestyle, and the nerds. But again, it was a good time in Tempe. Tempe was growing, but there was still sort of a distinction between Tempe and Mesa and Scottsdale. There was a little more distinct sense of identity, so I have kind of happy memories of that period of life as far as what it was like going through high school and socializing and going down to the river bottom on weekend nights where someone would have a bonfire and parties would be going on. I remember digging my friend Robert's 68 Oldsmobile out of the sand when we were driving around down in the river bottom and he got stuck there in the middle of the night. That was the Tempe thing back then. Now it's underwater, so it's an improvement. We have a beautiful lake with beautiful buildings around it, but the current generation of high school kids doesn't know what it's like to go sit around a bonfire in the riverbed with the old abandoned refrigerators and box springs and all that stuff.
Did you connect with any of the old-time families of Tempe when you were growing up, or was it more when you became an adult that you got to know more of the stories about the history of Tempe from the beginning?
Well, there were all kinds of interesting people in and out of the restaurant, and many of them, the older families. That's a deep well we could go down. Just all the time, daily reminders of that sort of thing. As I say, the Hugheses we were close with, the Haydens, right? My dad was very good friends with Hayden Hayden, who was an amazing character, and so.
Was he the nephew of Charles Hayden?
Exactly, and he was running the flour mill from the time I was born all the way until the mid '80s when. He ran it longer, but they had sold to Bay State Milling, who wanted to develop the property. I think that was around '85. But as I mentioned earlier, my dad had back problems, and when he finally had surgery to deal with the slip discs, he was bedridden for a while, and he needed electrical stimulation. His leg muscles were atrophied for a while, and he started hiking the Butte to rehabilitate himself. And that became a daily rhythm for him. And he started dragooning his friends into participating. So there was Hayden Hayden, Weldon Schofstall, Ross Rice, Colonel Weston Hyde, who used to run Williams Air Force Base. These people were all fascinating. Like Hyde had been a prisoner of war. The Germans had been shot down and held prisoner. Hayden, he'd been sent to military school in New Mexico and then got sent over to run I think it was the Sugiyama prison where they held the Japanese leadership after the surrender. I think he helped hang Tojo. He was a remarkable person, but he was a real character. And so I would be invited to sometimes hike up the Butte with the old guys when I was a kid and listen to their stories and listen to them discuss politics and current affairs. A lot of letters to the editor came out of those hikes up the Butte. They'd go back down and my dad would jump on his old telegraph operator's typewriter that he had and hammer out some missive to the paper. So there were a number of families associated with the restaurant, who'd come in as customers. Interesting times. There was the world has changed a lot. For example, down First Street. Now it's, Rio Salado Parkway all the way down, but they didn't realign it till, I don't know, say like 1996 or 98. So it was First Street, and it turned to dirt on the other side of the railroad tracks there at Ash. And there were these little ranchettes, and there was an old fellow named Howard Heinzel who was like a retired highway patrolman, but he used to breed pit bulls down the street for fighting. And again, the world has changed now, but that was kind of taken for granted as one of the things that went on. And Howard would come in to the kitchen. He'd drive his pickup truck, and he'd come in with a straw cowboy hat, wearing a set of coveralls, and a couple buckets, and he'd get scraps of steaks from the dishwasher to take down the street for the dogs. He was, again, a character. He'd walk right in the kitchen with a cigar clamped in his teeth. And so he had to move out and move to Levine when they paved the road and assessed everybody, and he decided he couldn't afford to pay the assessment. But those were the kind of people that were around. So, yeah, I mean, we could go all night on
the different people who came in. I'm sure there were politicians and all kinds of people.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, and just extraordinary. I was speaking to a group of retired Arizona Air Guard pilots. They asked me to talk about the restaurant, so I came in the banquet room. And I had just been reading a book about Frank Lloyd Wright, and it was about his migrations out to Taliesin West every winter. And I forget why it came up in the context of that talk. I think maybe we were all talking about Gamage Auditorium. But I mentioned, how he would, according to this book, he'd drive this tomato red convertible Lincoln that he had purchased. And a guy in the group, so this is a guy who used to be an Arizona Air Guard pilot, called out to me. He said, I was working here as a waiter. So it was even before my dad took over. It was just whoever was running the restaurant. He says, and I saw Wright pull up in that car. Just stepped right out of history right there. I mean, I have an eyewitness that saw Frank Lloyd Wright pull up in that Lincoln that I just read about in this book and come into the restaurant. I have a guy who used to work for the city, showed me old family black and white movies of Carmen Miranda sitting in a touring car in front of the Hayden House. And, we had... when Stephen Hawking was speaking at Gamage, his entourage brought him in 2 nights in a row, unexpectedly. Just Stephen Hawking's here. So that was the fun stuff, and you never knew who was going to be in. We had they brought in the Minister of Defense from Kazakhstan, big strapping guy, and I remember particularly because he would be a cabinet level person, so he was entitled as a diplomatic matter to an armed escort. So they had a couple of, I think they were DPS plainclothes guys with prominent sidearms, not because they thought anyone was going to try to bump him off at our restaurant, but because it was a matter of protocol. And just all kinds of little things like that. It wasn't, celebrities are interesting, but it was more like the variety of people we got, the political figures, both local and international, sometimes actors or athletes, and then just a lot of customers who had very interesting stories to tell. I got waved over to a booth by a customer who said that he used to work for the telephone company, right, Mountain Bell, and he said, I'll have you know that every call from the West Coast to the East Coast went through your parking lot. He said, because there's a phone pole out there, the line comes in from across the river over at Phoenix, and it goes underground and through your restaurant to the switching center. And I always thought that was interesting. If someone had backed into that pole, we might have cut off the western United States.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the steak, but what about the rosemary bread? People have memories of that.
Okay, so the rosemary bread we came to call Roman bread.
Roman bread. Okay.
That was my dad's term for it. Technically, we would, these days people are enlightened, they're foodies, and you would call it focaccia. But what happened is that is the fruit of our family's ties to Italy. So we would go to visit my Aunt Emilia, who was one of the 4 Montecchiani kids born in Italy before my grandfather came over. Because that was our actual last name would be Montecchiani, Montecchiani.
Okay.
And my dad and my Uncle Joe, who was the oldest son, my grandfather and my Uncle Joe, when they arrived here in the United States, they decided to cut it down because they knew it would be butchered by the Anglo-Saxon bureaucrats who would be, so they voluntarily cut it down. As I say, the spelling of the name was Montecchiani, and this is a true story. They decided to cut it down but change the E to an I because they did not want, under any circumstances, for anyone to mistake us for a French family.
Right.
And so they wanted to make sure it was a distinctly
We had
Italian
some Italian
spelling.
pride there.
Yeah.
Right.
But the bread was, so my Aunt Emilia was one of the older kids who was born. She, during World War II, married an Italian prisoner of war who had been released to work in the shipyards, and they wound up settling in Auburn, Washington, near Seattle. And we would go visit my aunt, and she would cook some wonderful things. And one of those wonderful things was this bread, the focaccia with the original version was thinly sliced onions on top with kosher salt and then rosemary. And my mom started making small batches of that and bringing it up for these little dinners or groups they'd have. And people liked it so much that people were saying, Leonard, why are you serving these dinner rolls? Serve that stuff. So then the challenge was to scale that, make that bread in a way that could be produced en masse for the volume the restaurant was doing. And so they made some modifications, and one of them was the onions that would have been thin sliced on top were sort of partially, they went to a dehydrated onion bits, but just partially reconstituted them and put them right in the dough. So you have the bread with the onions, a little bit of onion in the dough, and then salt and rosemary on top. But that started with just informal batches being brought up from my mom's kitchen and then converted. So, and it is, for being a steakhouse, it's one of the memories that people most strongly associate with the place.
It is so strong. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen it mentioned online that someone doesn't bring up the rosemary.
And some people,
bread.
Some people hated the rosemary, so they would brush it off like kids. So every so often pull the booths out, the seats of the booths, and you'd see like snowdrifts of rosemary that had accumulated underneath.
Probably permeated the whole restaurant.
Yeah, yeah. But I had a guy write a letter once that he had been paralyzed in a motorcycle accident, and he used to come out here in the winters and miss the bread. So we shipped him some bread, just because that when someone says that's what they really miss. So sometimes I toy with the idea of maybe doing a little food truck that focuses mainly on the bread. But I don't know if I want to tackle that just yet. But
talking about a career change, so let's go with that. Let's go with, are you the first college graduate in your family? Were you first generation or somebody else?
No, I think my older sister graduated a long time ago, but I know that my parents were very concerned. The overall track record in the first group of kids was not strong for different reasons. So I made a point. I made it through ASU, and then I decided to go to law school. So I'm pretty sure I'm the first one who got a graduate degree.
And then just briefly, like I know it could take a while, but what were the highlights then of your career changes as you went from, went to law school, at one point you became the manager and owner?
Well, yeah, so that is a deep rabbit hole.
Just the highlights.
Yeah, well my dad actually, he was getting on in age, and he actually wanted to sell the business. There were a lot of complications to selling it, testamentary stuff from his first his settlement when he divorced his first wife, and a lot of the 80s was spent cleaning those things up. And he was interested in selling when I was in law school, and he actually had an agent, and I flew back a few times to kind of help show the place and talk terms. But it was a hard business to sell for a few reasons. One is is a huge, rambling, unique restaurant, a lot of deferred maintenance, to say the least, and the fear that anybody who would buy it would be exposed to the risk that when people heard that it had changed hands and was no longer owned by Leonard Monti, that the business might collapse. You know, the question was how well would the goodwill transfer? So he had a hard time getting what he wanted out of it. So by the time I finished law school, and then I came back and essentially took over operating it, with continuing to think that maybe we'd be able to find a buyer. During that period of time, I went ahead and sat for the bar, passed the bar. But then I wound up partnering with an acquaintance who was a little older than me, but he had a master's from Thunderbird, Ralph Edward Goitia. And we wound up buying the business out so that we could perpetuate it. That's took the next 20 years. We had a long partnership. So that's really how it happened. And then after I sold, I went into legal practice for about a year and a half. And then really at that point I didn't need to do that. And kind of hung that up for a while. And then since then I've been working as a private investigator. So the money isn't as good, but the scenery changes, so it's more interesting. But it was an interesting period of time because when we took over the restaurant, I stepped in 93 and then brought Goitia in as a general manager, and then we worked on financing and finally bought it out from my dad's trust in 97. The environment for restaurants in the Valley was changing massively during those years. All kinds of chains roll in, Outback Steakhouse and Macaroni Grill and you name it. All these different chains rolled in and sliced and diced the market in very demographically discrete bits and siphoned off different types of customer. It also educated our customers to have different expectations. And so that was the beginning of a long period of time when you have to balance the needs of how do you address what your legacy customers want who come with certain things in mind and you want to please them, but how do you add new things and modify things to attract new and younger customers and keep the train going. So that was the beginning of that time where we were constantly looking at what can we do to strike that balance.
What keeps you in Tempe now, Mckell? What does it mean to you to live here in Tempe and have your children grow up here?
Just the strong sense of community. Tempe's landlocked, 40 square miles, so I pretty much can't move around town with running into someone that I know, and I like that. I like to go to the supermarket and run into a couple of people that I used to do business with or belonged to the Rotary Club with or was in the Diablos with or you name it. I really enjoy that feeling of just interacting with people. Tempe is a unique environment because we're in the center of the valley and we have the university as a stimulant of currents of fresh thought from all over the world. It's got a vibrancy that I like, and it's home. It's home, and my three youngest kids I was able to put through Broadmoor Elementary, which is kind of the elementary school here in Tempe, and I think they'll always think of Tempe as home, no matter where the world takes them, and I like that feeling.
We have so many more questions and we're out of time, so we might have to do a part two sometime.
Well, I'd love to. Hopefully it won't be as complicated to get me down here. I have to go to the Navajo Nation tomorrow on business, so I've been scrambling to get ready for that all day and then have kid stuff to take care of, so I apologize for not being here sooner.
That's all right. I know you mentioned the Rotary Club and the Diablos, so those are service organizations, correct?
Yes.
And so that's a part of your life too, to give back to the community and I've always believed in that. Probably doing things on a smaller scale now,
more focused on my kids' schools and kind of up close. I mean, when I walked in here, my wife had us feeding the cats in the volunteer rotation, so all the cats out there kind of recognized me when I walked in. But yeah, you know, stay involved, keep the hand in the community in some way, big or small.
Right, well, let's close with this. How would you like your loved ones to remember you someday? I know that's not a good transition. I mean, we skipped so much in between, but let's work with that one.
Oh, well, I just, you know, my loved ones are probably going to remember you as someone who talked a lot. But, you know, I'd like them to remember me as a warm person who tried to stay involved in their lives and you know, just share companionship and fellowship and joy of living with them. You know, I hope that will be the legacy.
That is a wonderful legacy. Thank you for your thoughts tonight. I appreciate your time.
I'm honored to be asked. I hope some benefit comes of this. So.